Welcome to Mystery Unlocked, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unraveled. Grab your favorite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1. The widow's ominous warning. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Glancing up as the sitting room door opened, Eleanor Winthrop stood in the doorway, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her voice holding a tremor. "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied warmly, noting the woman's pale complexion and the way she clutched her handbag with nervous fingers. "Come in and sit down." Eleanor lowered herself into a chair, glancing about the room as if ensuring they were alone. She licked her lips, then leaned forward. "I believe I am going to be murdered." Miss Marple's hand stilled in her lap. She had known Eleanor Winthrop for years, an independent widow, sharp-minded, and not given to hysterics. The bluntness of her words gave them weight. "Murdered," Miss Marple repeated, her voice even. "That is a most serious thing to say, Mrs. Winthrop. Why do you believe so?" Eleanor exhaled shakily, gripping her handbag tighter. "I cannot explain it properly. It is a feeling, no, more than that. A certainty. I have noticed things. My belongings disturbed when no one should have been in my room. The way people look at me, as if they are waiting." She shuddered. "I have always believed that one's instincts should not be ignored." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And whom do you suspect?" Eleanor hesitated. "I am not sure, but I have my doubts about certain people. Those who once relied upon me." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened at the phrase. "Go on." Eleanor hesitated, then shook her head. I cannot say more. Not yet. But I have written something down." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small sealed envelope. "If anything happens to me, open this." Miss Marple took the envelope, turning it over in her hands. The seal was firm. Eleanor's neat handwriting scrawled across the front. "To be opened only in the event of my death." "You have spoken to the police?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor gave a humorless smile. "And tell them what?" "That I have a feeling someone intends to kill me." "No, Miss Marple, they would call me an old woman with an overactive imagination." Miss Marple did not argue. She had, after all, been dismissed in much the same way before. Instead, she studied Eleanor's face. There was no mistaking the genuine fear in her eyes. "If you are in danger, should you not leave St. Mary Mead for a time?" Miss Marple suggested. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I will not run from my own home. If they mean to kill me, they will do so whether I am here or elsewhere." She gave a short, tight laugh. "Besides, Miss Marple, I do not think I have long left in this world, one way or another." Miss Marple did not like the sound of that thought. After a long pause, Eleanor straightened and stood, composing herself. "I will not take up any more of your time. You are very kind to listen." Miss Marple also rose. "Take care, Mrs. Winthrop." Eleanor smiled faintly, but it did not reach her eyes. "I shall try." And with that, she left. Miss Marple remained standing, the sealed envelope cooled between her fingers. Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. A certainty, a feeling, that should not be ignored. She glanced out of the window just in time to see Eleanor disappearing down the lane, walking briskly. Despite her age, for a moment, Miss Marple had the unsettling impression that she was watching a woman already marked by fate. She placed the envelope in a drawer and shut it firmly. The next day news spread through St. Mary Mead with shocking speed. Eleanor Winthrop had been found dead in her home. Miss Marple heard it first from Mrs. Partridge at the grocer's, then again from Colonel Weston's wife outside the post office. But it was when young Inspector Graves arrived at her cottage, hat in hand, that she knew it was true. "I expect you've heard, Miss Marple," he said. "Tragic business. Looks like a burglary gone wrong." Miss Marple invited him inside, offering tea, which he declined. "A burglary," she repeated. Graves nodded. "House was in disarray. Front window broken. No signs of forced entry elsewhere, but drawers ransacked. Must have startled the intruder." He sighed. "Poor woman. Seems she put up a struggle." Miss Marple frowned slightly. "In what was taken?" "Jewelry, some cash. The usual things." Miss Marple did not speak immediately. Instead, she rose, crossed the room, and pulled open the drawer where she had placed Eleanor's envelope. She regarded it for a long moment before turning back to Graves. She came to see me yesterday, she said quietly. She told me she believed she was going to be murdered. Graves let out a breath. Ah, well, she was an elderly woman, wasn't she? Perhaps her mind was. No, Miss Marple interrupted. Her mind was quite sound. Graves cleared his throat. Be that as it may, we've no evidence of murder. Miss Marple, just an unfortunate case of a break-in turned violent. Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. I do not believe that for a moment. He sighed. And why not? She held up the envelope. Because she left me this. Graves frowned. What is it? A letter, to be opened only in the event of her death. The inspector shifted uncomfortably. And have you read it? Miss Marple carefully broke the seal, unfolding the paper inside. Her eyes scanned the short message, and she felt a cold weight settle in her chest. One line. Look to those who once needed me most. Miss Marple slowly closed the letter, deep in thought. She had no doubt now. Eleanor Winthrop had been murdered, and the killer was someone who had once needed her. Chapter 2. Death at the Winthrop estate. Miss Marple arrived at Winthrop House just before noon. The grand yet aging home sat at the end of a narrow lane, its windows staring blankly at the village. The sight of a broken front window and a group of officers moving in and out of the house filled her with an uneasy certainty. This was no ordinary burglary. A uniformed constable at the gate hesitated before recognizing her. Oh, Miss Marple, Inspector Graves is inside. Miss Marple nodded and stepped past him, careful to observe everything: the garden path, the undisturbed flower beds, the lack of any real signs of forced entry except the broken glass. It was staged, she felt sure of it. A genuine burglar would have left footprints, trampled bushes, some sign of a hurried escape, but the ground was pristine, the front door still locked. She found Inspector Graves inside, speaking to a solemn-faced Alice Prentice, Eleanor's long-serving housekeeper. The drawing room was a mess: overturned drawers, scattered papers, a broken lamp, and yet something about the disarray felt deliberate. Graves glanced up as she entered. Miss Marple, I suppose I should have expected you. She gave a polite smile. I do hope you don't mind, Inspector. Mrs. Winthrop was a friend. Graves sighed. Well, since you're here, you may as well hear it from me. As I said before, looks like a burglary gone wrong. Mrs. Winthrop likely caught the intruder in the act and paid the price for it. Miss Marple turned to Alice. The woman's face was pale, her hands wringing the edge of her apron. You were the one who found her? Alice nodded shakily. Yes, miss. I come in every morning to clean and cook. She was in the study. I knew straight away there was nothing I could do. Her voice trembled. She was so frightened lately. She said she felt something bad was going to happen. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on Alice's arm. And did she tell you why? Alice hesitated. She said someone had been in the house. She thought she heard things in the night, things out of place. I told her she should speak to the police, but she wouldn't. She said she had to figure it out herself. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the broken window. Alice, was this window always latched at night? Alice swallowed hard. Yes, miss, I checked it myself. Miss Marple looked at Graves, and yet it was broken from the outside. Graves folded his arms. That's what it looks like. Miss Marple frowned, stepping closer to the window. The glass had shattered inward, yet the shards had not scattered far. Most of it lay in a neat pile beneath the frame. Odd, she murmured. Graves sighed. Miss Marple, you may be clever, but let's be sensible. If she thought someone was after her, it stands to reason that she was anxious and imagining things. Miss Marple met his gaze. She left me a letter, Inspector. His expression tightened. What sort of letter? She retrieved it from her handbag and handed it to him. He unfolded the note and read aloud. Look to those who once needed me most. A silence settled over the room. Graves rubbed the back of his neck. What do you make of it? Miss Marple folded her hands. Mrs. Winthrop was a woman of great intelligence. She would not write such a thing lightly. She knew something. Inspector, perhaps not enough to accuse, but enough to leave a clue. Graves exhaled sharply. Fine. If you insist on playing detective, who are we looking at? Miss Marple glanced at Alice, who had reason to need Mrs. Winthrop, financially, emotionally, or otherwise. Alice bit her lip. Well, there's Sylvia, of course. Miss Lorimer, her niece. They hadn't been close for years, but she visited not long ago, asking about the will. Graves scowled. Motive enough, I suppose. Anyone else? Alice hesitated. Gerald Hawkins came back to the village a few weeks ago. He and Mrs. Winthrop knew each other a long time ago, but she didn't seem pleased to see him again. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Why not? Alice lowered her voice. He had a reputation, Miss, left under difficult circumstances. Some say she helped him once, but she never spoke of it. Miss Marple nodded. Two names, two possibilities. Graves ran a hand through his hair. All right, we'll question them both. But I still say it's a burglary gone wrong. Miss Marple only smiled. I dare say we shall see. That afternoon Sylvia Lorimer arrived at Winthrop House in a flurry of tears, her pale blue dress impeccable despite the grief-stricken expression she wore. I can't believe it, she gasped. Aunt Eleanor Graves watched her carefully. Who said anything about murder? Miss Lorimer. Sylvia blinked, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Oh, well, isn't that what happened? A terrible burglary so violent, she shuddered. Miss Marple observed her closely. There was something too well rehearsed about the distress. When did you last see your aunt, my dear? Sylvia straightened. About a month ago. We hadn't spoken in a while, but I wanted to mend things. Miss Marple tilted her head. Mend things. Sylvia hesitated. I was upset about the will. She had promised me certain things, but then she changed her mind. I didn't mean to argue, but she trailed off. Looking down, Graves's expression darkened. And did she tell you why she changed it? Sylvia's lips pressed together. No, she only said she had other priorities now. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Graves. A motive, indeed. But was it enough? That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, reviewing everything she had learned. The note, the staged burglary, the people who once needed Eleanor Winthrop, Sylvia, who had expected an inheritance and received nothing, Gerald Hawkins, who had returned just before Eleanor's death, and Alice, who knew more than she was saying. She glanced again at the crime scene notes Graves had reluctantly let her see. The valuables still present, the ransacked drawers, yet nothing, obviously missing, nothing, except what the killer had truly come for. She picked up Eleanor's note once more, running her fingers over the faded ink. Look to those who once needed me most. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. She would, because one of them had murdered Eleanor Winthrop, and she intended to find out who. As she reached for her tea, a knock sounded at her door. Miss Marple glanced at the clock. It was late, too late for a social visit. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and opened the door. A figure stood in the darkness. Miss Marple, the voice said, low and hesitant. I think I know something about Mrs. Winthrop's death. Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching us from. Drop your city and country in the comments. Bellow Chapter 3. A visitor in the night. Miss Marple peered at the figure standing on her doorstep. The glow from her sitting room lamp cast just enough light to reveal the sharp, nervous features of Alice Prentice, Mrs. Winthrop's housekeeper. Alice, Miss Marple said gently, do come in. Alice hesitated, glancing over her shoulder into the darkness before stepping inside. She wrung her hands as she hovered near the fireplace, her usual composure replaced by restless energy. I shouldn't be here, she whispered. I don't know if I should say anything at all. Miss Marple sat down, regarding Alice with a calm, expectant gaze. But something has been troubling you, hasn't it? Alice nodded rapidly. Yes, Miss Marple, and after what happened to Mrs. Winthrop, I can't keep quiet. Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. Take your time, my dear. Alice perched on the edge of the chair, her hands twisting in her lap. It's about the night before she died. There was something strange, something I should have mentioned sooner. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Go on. Alice swallowed hard. I stayed later than usual that evening. Mrs. Winthrop wasn't herself, restless, pacing. I asked if she was all right, and she just said, they won't stop until they get what they want. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. And did she say who they were? Alice shook her head. No, but then she hesitated, lowering her voice. Someone came to the house. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Someone? Alice nodded. I was in the kitchen, clearing up, when I heard the front door open. Mrs. Winthrop never had visitors at that hour. I crept to the hallway and listened. Miss Marple's heart quickened. And what did you hear? Alice bit her lip. A man's voice, low, urgent, he said. It's too late to change things now. Miss Marple's mind immediately recalled the two men with a potential motive, Gerald Hawkins, the man from her past, and Inspector Graves' primary suspect, the unknown burglar. But was the latter even real? Did you recognize the voice? She asked. Alice hesitated, then shook her head. No, but Mrs. Winthrop sounded angry. She said, "I won't be threatened in my own home." Miss Marple's mind raced. Eleanor had known she was in danger, and yet she had not turned the visitor away. What happened next? Alice took a deep breath. "I thought about going in, but then the voices lowered, and I couldn't make out the words. A few minutes later, I heard the front door close. When I finally went to check, Mrs. Winthrop was standing in the hall, white as a sheet. Miss Marple's brow furrowed, and she said nothing. Alice shook her head. "Just told me to go home. Said she had things to think about." A heavy silence settled between them. "You must tell the police," Miss Marple finally said. Alice shuddered. "What if they don't believe me?" Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "Then we shall make them believe you." The next morning Inspector Graves was not pleased to see Miss Marple again so soon. He sighed heavily as she sat opposite him in his cramped office at the local police station. Alice, sitting stiffly beside her. "You mean to tell me Mrs. Winthrop had a visitor on the night before her death?" he asked, rubbing his temple. "Yes," Miss Marple said patiently, and the conversation was of a most threatening nature. Graves glanced at Alice. "Did you see this man?" Alice shook her head. "No, sir. Only heard him." Graves exhaled sharply. "Well, it's something, at least, but without knowing who it was, we're no closer to an answer." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I wonder, Inspector, has anything been taken from the house besides valuables?" Graves frowned. "Not that we've noticed." "Why?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Because I do not believe this was about money. Eleanor Winthrop was not killed for jewelry. She was killed because of something she knew." Graves looked skeptical. "And what would that be?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is what we must find out." A visit to Gerald Hawkins leaving the station. Miss Marple and Alice made their way to the village inn, where Gerald Hawkins had been staying since his return. The innkeeper, Mr. Jeffries, greeted them at the door. "Mr. Hawkins," he said, furrowing his brow, "not sure if he's in, keeps odd hours, that one." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Then perhaps we shall wait." As they settled into the lounge, the door creaked open, and a man stepped in. He was tall, with a weathered face and eyes that flickered warily when he saw Miss Marple. "Mr. Hawkins," she said kindly. "How fortunate. We were just hoping to see you." His mouth tightened. "What for?" Miss Marple observed him carefully. "To ask about Mrs. Winthrop." A shadow crossed his face. "What about her?" "She was murdered, Mr. Hawkins." Gerald's jaw clenched. "I know that." Miss Marple did not look away. "And you were one of the last people to see her alive, were you not?" His eyes flickered. "Just for a moment." "Who told you that?" "Alice heard someone speaking with her that night." Gerald exhaled sharply. "Look, I won't lie. I did see Eleanor, but not that night, the night before." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And why was that?" Gerald hesitated. "She had something that belonged to me." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And what was that?" Gerald's face darkened. "Something I left behind a long time ago." A long silence followed. "I didn't kill her," he muttered. She was different that night. Said she was afraid. I told her I just wanted what was mine, and she refused to give it to me." Miss Marple's mind whirred. "And what did she say?" Gerald swallowed. "She said, some things should remain buried." Miss Marple sat very still. Buried. Eleanor had been hiding something, and it had cost her life. As she turned to leave, Gerald spoke again, his voice quieter. "If I were you, Miss Marple, I'd be careful asking too many questions." Miss Marple paused, her expression unreadable. Then, with a polite nod, she stepped out into the village air, already forming her next move. Chapter 4. A key in the ashes. Miss Marple returned to her cottage with a thoughtful expression. Gerald Hawkins's words echoed in her mind. Some things should remain buried. Eleanor Winthrop had been afraid, yet she had refused to give Gerald what he had come for. And now, she was dead. What had she been protecting? Miss Marple settled into her armchair, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. She picked up Eleanor's note once more. "Look to those who once needed me most." She thought of Eleanor's past, those she had aided, the secrets she had kept. There was something deeper at play here, and Miss Marple was determined to find out what. The next morning after breakfast, she walked to Winthrop House, where Inspector Graves and his men were still conducting their investigation. The house felt different now, its air heavy with the absence of its mistress. Graves spotted her at the door and sighed. "Back again, Miss Marple," she smiled. "I did say I would be useful, Inspector." He gestured for her to enter. The drawing room was still in disarray, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted something new. The fireplace. Ashes had been disturbed. Someone had burned something. Miss Marple knelt by the hearth, her gloved fingers delicately sifting through the charred remains. And then her fingertips brushed against something small. Metallic dot. She carefully pulled it from the ashes. A key dot. It was partially blackened, but still intact. Miss Marple turned it over, studying the faint markings on its surface. Graves leaned in. "What have you found?" Miss Marple held up the key. This was burned deliberately. Someone wanted to destroy it. Graves frowned. "But why?" Miss Marple smiled. "Because it opened something important. An unexpected encounter." Miss Marple decided to visit Sylvia Lorimer, Eleanor's niece. She found Sylvia in the garden of her cottage, her face pale against the morning sun. "Miss Marple," Sylvia greeted, attempting a smile. "I suppose you've heard. It's all so dreadful." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Yes, my dear. And yet, I wonder, why did you visit your aunt last month? You said you wished to mend things." Sylvia hesitated. I suppose I was hoping to discuss the will." Miss Marple nodded. "And what did she say?" Sylvia's face darkened. "She refused to change it. Said she had other priorities." Miss Marple observed her reaction closely. "And did she mention what those priorities were?" Sylvia's fingers clenched around her shawl. "No, only that it wasn't about money." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and produced the burnt key. "Do you recognize this?" Sylvia's eyes widened. "Where did you find that?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "So you do recognize it?" Sylvia hesitated. "It looks like one of the keys from Aunt Eleanor's writing desk." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Her writing desk?" Sylvia nodded. "She kept important papers there, but it was always locked." Miss Marple pressed gently. "Do you know what was inside?" Sylvia hesitated, then shook her head. "No, but I saw her put something inside the day I visited. Something in an envelope." Miss Marple's mind raced. The key had been burned, but why? What had Eleanor locked away? A return to Winthrop House. Determined to find the desk, Miss Marple returned to Winthrop House. Alice Prentice met her at the door, looking nervous. "I have another question for you, Alice," Miss Marple said kindly. "Do you know where Mrs. Winthrop kept her writing desk?" Alice nodded. "Yes, miss. In her study." Miss Marple followed Alice down the hall. The study was a small, book-lined room, untouched since Eleanor's death. And there, against the far wall, stood the desk. Alice bit her lip. The police checked it, but it was locked. Miss Marple smiled. "Then let us see if this key still serves its purpose." She inserted the burnt key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Alice gasped. Miss Marple lifted the lid. Inside were neatly arranged papers, bills, letters, receipts, but it was a single envelope that caught her attention. It was labeled in Eleanor's careful script, "For Miss Marple." Alice clutched her apron. "She left something for you." Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She read the note aloud. "If anything happens to me, look to the past. The answer lies in what was lost." A chill ran through her. Eleanor had known she was in danger, and she had left a final clue. A disturbing revelation. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "Alice, did Mrs. Winthrop ever speak of something she regretted?" Alice frowned. "Not often, but she once mentioned a child. A long time ago. She said she had made a mistake, and that she hoped to set it right." Miss Marple's breath caught. A child? Could this be what Gerald Hawkins was after? Alice hesitated. "Miss Marple, do you think this has something to do with why she was killed?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, my dear, I believe it does." As Miss Marple stood to leave, the front door creaked open. Inspector Graves entered, his expression grim. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've just found something troubling." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "What is it, Inspector?" He hesitated. "A witness claims they saw Gerald Hawkins near the house the night Mrs. Winthrop was murdered." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The pieces were falling into place. But was Gerald really the killer? Or was the true murderer still waiting in the shadows? Chapter 5. Secrets in the Ledger. Miss Marple sat across from Inspector Graves in his office, her fingers lightly resting on the envelope Eleanor Winthrop had left for her. The note inside had been simple, yet ominous. "If anything happens to me, look to the past. The answer lies in what was lost." And now, a new complication. Gerald Hawkins had been seen near Winthrop House on the night of Eleanor's murder. Graves tapped his fingers on his desk. It's rather damning, wouldn't you say? Miss Marple Hawkins was in town, had a past with Mrs. Winthrop, and now a witness places him at the scene. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily convinced. She had watched Gerald's reaction closely when she had questioned him. His fear had been real, but was it the fear of a murderer or something else? "Inspector," she said gently, "does this witness claim to have seen Gerald enter the house?" Graves frowned. "No, only near the house. But it was late. Why else would he be there?" Miss Marple smiled. "That, I believe, is worth investigating." A visit to Gerald Hawkins returning to the village inn, Miss Marple found Gerald sitting alone by the fire in the lounge. He looked up, wary, as she approached. Miss Marple, his voice was guarded. "Back again." She took a seat across from him. "Mr. Hawkins, I must ask you plainly, were you near Winthrop House on the night of Mrs. Winthrop's murder?" His jaw tightened. "I didn't kill her. That was not my question." Gerald exhaled sharply. "Fine. Yes, I was near the house, but I didn't go inside." "Then why were you there?" He hesitated. "I was looking for something." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Something Mrs. Winthrop had taken from you." Gerald's expression darkened. "She had no right to keep it." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "What was it?" Gerald hesitated, then muttered, "A ledger." Miss Marple's sharp-minded word. "A ledger," he nodded. "From years ago, something that, well, let's just say, if it were found, it would explain everything." The hidden ledger. Miss Marple knew where she needed to look next. Returning to Winthrop House, she asked Alice Prentice about any ledgers Eleanor might have kept. Alice's brow furrowed. "She did have some old books in the study. Shall I show you?" Miss Marple followed Alice to the study. Against one wall stood a bookshelf, neatly arranged. But Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. "The answer lies in what was lost." Miss Marple studied the shelf, running her fingers along the spines of the books, and then she noticed it one book slightly newer than the rest, its binding stiff. She pulled it free. Inside, pages were filled with careful handwriting, detailing financial transactions and names. But one entry, dated nearly 25 years ago, stood out. "For the child arrangements made. No records to remain." Miss Marple's breath caught. "A child. Alice gasped softly. "Miss Marple, what does it mean?" Miss Marple's mind raced. If this ledger was what Gerald had been after, then Eleanor had been hiding something much larger than anyone had guessed. And someone had killed to keep it secret. Chapter 6. The child that never was. Miss Marple sat by the fire in her cottage, the worn leather ledger resting on her lap. The words inside were damning. "For the child arrangements made. No records to remain. A child, hidden, forgotten, but by whom?" Eleanor Winthrop had clearly gone to great lengths to keep this secret buried. And yet, someone had feared discovery so much that they had killed her. Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. This child was the key to the mystery. A visit to the solicitor early the next morning. Miss Marple paid a visit to Mr. Humphrey, Eleanor Winthrop's solicitor. His office was a dimly lit room above the post office, cluttered with legal papers and ledgers. Mr. Humphrey, a balding man with sharp eyes, adjusted his spectacles as she entered. "Miss Marple," he greeted. "To what do I owe this visit?" She placed the ledger on his desk. "Mr. Humphrey, I believe Mrs. Winthrop once entrusted you with a rather delicate matter." His eyes flickered with recognition. "Where did you find this?" Miss Marple studied him. "Then you do know what it contains?" He hesitated. "Miss Marple, there are certain matters that should not be stirred up." Her expression remained calm. "Mrs. Winthrop is dead. Someone murdered her. I believe this ledger is the reason." Mr. Humphrey exhaled sharply. "Then you must understand there was a child." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. But what happened to them?" He hesitated, then leaned forward. "Many years ago, Mrs. Winthrop came to me in great distress. She had assisted in arranging the adoption of a child." Miss Marple's mind word, "Not her own." "No," he said firmly. "But she felt responsible. There were complications, legal and personal. She wanted to ensure the child's future was secure." Miss Marple considered this. "And did she ever speak of trying to find them again?" Humphrey sighed. "Yes, recently in fact. She was troubled. She said she had reason to believe the child's past had come back to haunt them." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And did she mention a name?" Humphrey hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Gerald Hawkins." A confrontation with Gerald. Miss Marple left the solicitor's office with renewed urgency. Could Gerald have been the child Eleanor had helped? Was this the secret Eleanor had kept all these years? She found him at the village inn, nursing a drink by the fire. His eyes narrowed as she approached. "You don't give up, do you?" he muttered. Miss Marple smiled. "Persistence has its merits, Mr. Hawkins." She sat opposite him. "Tell me, how well did you truly know Mrs. Winthrop?" Gerald scoffed. "Well enough." Miss Marple observed him closely. "Did you know she once arranged an adoption?" His fingers tightened around his glass. "What?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "You seem surprised." Gerald's face darkened. "What are you saying?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "I believe Mrs. Winthrop knew something about your past. Something that might change everything. You thought you knew about yourself." Gerald's breath hitched. He stared at her, something raw in his expression. I never knew my parents," he admitted, voice low. "Grew up in foster homes. Always felt like there was something missing." Miss Marple nodded. "Perhaps Mrs. Winthrop knew the truth." Gerald swallowed hard. "Then why didn't she just tell me?" Miss Marple's expression was solemn. "Perhaps she intended to, but someone made certain she never got the chance." A new suspect emerges. Miss Marple left Gerald deep in thought, but her own mind was racing. If Eleanor had been killed because of the child's identity, then there was someone else who had just as much at stakes, someone who had wanted that truth buried forever. Who else would have known about the adoption? And then it struck her. Sylvia Lorimer, Eleanor's niece. Sylvia had openly resented her aunt. She had also been the one to mention the will, to hint at Eleanor having other priorities. Could it be that she had known what those priorities were? Had she killed her aunt to ensure her own inheritance? Miss Marple turned in the direction of Sylvia's cottage. It was time for another conversation. As Miss Marple approached Sylvia's home, she noticed something strange. The front door was slightly ajar, and inside there was the sound of hurried movement. Someone was inside, and they were searching for something. Chapter 7. The desperate search. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. The door to Sylvia Lorimer's cottage was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Inside, she could hear hurried, frantic movements, papers rustling, drawers opening and slamming shut. Someone was searching for something. She took a breath and pushed the door fully open. "Sylvia." The shuffling stopped. A tense silence filled the air. Then, suddenly, Sylvia Lorimer emerged from the sitting room. Her face flushed, her hands gripping a crumpled sheet of paper. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, her voice too high, too forced. I wasn't expecting anyone." Miss Marple's sharp eyes swept over the disarray in the room behind her. Drawers pulled open, books scattered across the floor. "Are you looking for something, my dear?" she asked mildly. Sylvia swallowed, her grip on the paper tightening. "No, well, yes, just an old document I misplaced. It's nothing important." Miss Marple gave her a kindly smile. "How unfortunate. I do hope it wasn't something Mrs. Winthrop left behind." Sylvia's face blanched. "Why would you say that?" Miss Marple stepped forward slightly. "Because it seems to me that you are quite determined to find something she may have kept hidden." Sylvia exhaled sharply, turning away. "It's not what you think." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Then why don't you tell me what it is?" A slip of the tongue. Sylvia hesitated, then sighed, sinking into a chair. "I just wanted to know if she had changed her will," she muttered. "She told me she had other priorities. If she left everything to some charity instead of to me, I had a right to know." Miss Marple observed her carefully. "Or were you afraid she had left it to someone else?" Sylvia's head jerked up. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Mrs. Winthrop arranged an adoption years ago. A child, lost to time. Could it be that she was planning to find them again?" Sylvia's face darkened. "And what if she was?" Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "That would mean her fortune, her house, her possessions would not go to you. That must have been quite distressing." Sylvia clenched her jaw. "Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple sighed. "Not at all, dear. But I do wonder if Mrs. Winthrop was murdered because of what she knew. Then perhaps the killer is someone with a great deal to lose." Sylvia scoffed. But Miss Marple noticed the way her hands trembled. "A clue in the paper." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the crumpled paper Sylvia still held. "Might I see what you found?" Sylvia hesitated, then reluctantly handed it over. Miss Marple smoothed the sheet, her keen eyes scanning the text. It was a letter, an old one, and at the bottom, in faded ink, was a name she had not expected to see. Gerald Hawkins. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Sylvia, she said softly, how long have you known about Gerald? Sylvia paled. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple studied her carefully. You knew, didn't you, that Gerald was the child Mrs. Winthrop had once helped? Sylvia's lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple sighed. My dear, if you did know, then I must ask, how far would you go to keep that secret? Sylvia shot up from her chair. I didn't kill her. Miss Marple remained seated. Then why are you so afraid? Sylvia swallowed hard, then whispered, because someone else already knew. And you suspect? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Who? Sylvia hesitated, then muttered, Alice Prentice. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. Alice? Sylvia nodded. She's been with Aunt Eleanor for years. If anyone knew her secrets, it was her. And she's been acting strangely since the murder. Miss Marple considered this. Alice had been helpful, eager to assist. But was there something more beneath the surface? She stood. Thank you, Sylvia. You've been most helpful. Sylvia watched her go, her eyes wary. An unsettling visit. Miss Marple made her way to Winthrop House. The great house stood silent, its shutters drawn, as though mourning its mistress. Alice answered the door quickly, her eyes wide. Miss Marple, is something wrong? Miss Marple smiled warmly. Not at all, my dear. I was just hoping to speak with you. Alice hesitated, then stepped aside. Of course. Miss Marple followed her into the sitting room. Alice, I was wondering, how well did you know Mrs. Winthrop's affairs? Alice fidgeted. Well enough, I suppose. Miss Marple watched her carefully. And did you know about the child? Alice's breath hitched. What child? Miss Marple observed her reaction. Mrs. Winthrop arranged an adoption years ago, and I believe someone was very keen to make sure the truth never surfaced. Alice's hands trembled slightly. I don't know anything about that. Miss Marple tilted her head. You were her closest confidant. She must have spoken to you about her concerns. Alice swallowed. She was worried about something. She kept saying she needed to put things right. Miss Marple nodded. And did she ever mention who she was trying to find? Alice hesitated, then whispered, Gerald Hawkins. Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. And did she say why? Alice shook her head. Only that it was urgent, that she needed to tell him something before it was too late. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And then she was murdered. Alice's eyes filled with tears. I don't know anything about that. Miss Marple reached out and patted her hand. Perhaps not, my dear. But someone does. As Miss Marple left, she saw a figure lingering near the gate. Gerald Hawkins. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, and as she approached, he muttered, She was right, wasn't she? Miss Marple met his troubled gaze. Right about what, Mr. Hawkins? He swallowed hard. About who I really am. Chapter 8. The truth about Gerald. Miss Marple studied Gerald Hawkins carefully. He stood near the gate of Winthrop House, his posture tense, his expression grim. She was right, wasn't she? He muttered. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Right about what, Mr. Hawkins? He swallowed hard, eyes flickering with something close to fear. About who I really am. Miss Marple waited, allowing the silence to do its work. Finally, Gerald exhaled sharply and looked away. I think I was the child, he admitted, the one she arranged an adoption for. Miss Marple nodded. It does seem rather likely, doesn't it? His hands curled into fists. But why? Why did she never tell me? And why now, after all these years, was she suddenly so desperate to find me? Miss Marple regarded him with quiet sympathy. Perhaps she had only recently uncovered the truth herself. Or perhaps she knew something else, something dangerous. Gerald's jaw tightened. And now she's dead because of it. Miss Marple sighed. That does seem to be the case. He turned to her suddenly. You don't think I did it, do you? Miss Marple shook her head. No, Mr. Hawkins, I do not. Relief flickered in his eyes, but it was short-lived then. Who did? Miss Marple's voice was calm. That, I mean to find out. A discovery in the study that afternoon. Miss Marple returned to Winthrop House. She had a growing suspicion that Eleanor had left something behind, something important. She found Alice Prentice in the study, tidying the papers Miss Marple had disturbed during her previous visit. Oh, Miss Marple, Alice said, startled. I wasn't expecting you back so soon. Miss Marple smiled. I do apologize for the intrusion, my dear, but I was hoping to look at Mrs. Winthrop's desk once more. Alice hesitated, then stepped aside. Of course. Miss Marple moved to the large mahogany desk, her fingers tracing its surface thoughtfully. She began pulling open the drawers, scanning through their contents. receipts, letters, old household accounts, and then she found it, a second ledger. Her breath caught. It was much smaller than the one she had already found, bound in soft leather. She opened it carefully. Inside, Eleanor's familiar handwriting filled the pages. I have made a terrible mistake. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. I was wrong to believe him. If the truth comes to light, there will be consequences. But I cannot remain silent any longer. I must set things right before it is too late. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She turned the page. If anything happens to me, I fear it will be because the ink stopped abruptly. Miss Marple frowned. The sentence was incomplete, as if Eleanor had been interrupted, or worse, stopped. A confrontation at the vicarage's entry confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. Eleanor had feared for her life, and she had known who she was afraid of, but someone had ensured she never finished writing their name. Miss Marple left the study, her mind racing. There was someone she needed to see. She arrived at the vicarage just as Reverend Martin was tending to his garden. He looked up, smiling warmly. Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise. Miss Marple returned the smile. Good afternoon, Reverend. I was wondering if I might trouble you for a word. Of course, do come in. Inside, Miss Marple took a seat in the modest sitting room. The vicar poured tea, his movements unhurried. How can I help you? He asked kindly. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I was hoping you might tell me what you know about Eleanor Winthrop. Past? The vicar blinked. Her past. Yes, Miss Marple said mildly. I have reason to believe she was keeping a rather significant secret. Reverend Martin hesitated. Miss Marple, Eleanor was a complicated woman. She was deeply private. Miss Marple studied him. Yes, but I believe she confided in someone, perhaps even you. The vicar sighed, setting his teacup down. She did come to me recently, quite troubled. Miss Marple's heart quickened. And what did she say? Reverend Martin hesitated. She spoke of a great mistake she had made in her youth, something about a child. She felt she had done something unforgivable. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Did she mention Gerald Hawkins? The vicar's expression flickered, ever so slightly. No, he said carefully. Miss Marple tilted her head. Are you quite sure? He hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, but Miss Marple saw it, and she understood. And you suspect? Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but her mind was racing. Reverend Martin was lying, and that raised an important question. Why? She finished her tea, setting the cup down lightly. Thank you, Reverend. You've been most helpful. The vicar smiled, but it did not quite reach his eyes. Always happy to assist, Miss Marple. She stood, smoothing her skirt. Oh, just one last thing, she said lightly. Were you acquainted with Sylvia Lorimer? The vicar blinked. Sylvia, why do you ask? Oh, no reason, Miss Marple said airily. Only that she seemed to think Mrs. Winthrop had changed her will. Do you know if that's true? Reverend Martin's grip tightened on the arm of his chair. Miss Marple did not miss it. She smiled sweetly. Well, thank you for the tea, Reverend. I do believe I shall be seeing you again quite soon. As she stepped outside, the cool air filled her lungs. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but there was still one question left, unanswered. If Eleanor had changed her will, who had the most to lose? Chapter 9. The Hidden Will. Miss Marple left the vicarage with a thoughtful expression. The Reverend Martin had been uneasy, too careful with his words. That hesitation had not gone unnoticed. J.C. walked briskly back toward the village, her mind piecing together the puzzle. If Eleanor Winthrop had changed her will, and Sylvia Lorimer had been searching so desperately for it, then the new beneficiary had to be someone unexpected. And if Eleanor's death was connected to this change, then someone had killed to keep that will hidden. There was only one logical course of action. She needed to find it before the murderer did. A visit to the solicitor. Miss Marple made her way to the small office of Mr. Alfred Mortimer, the village solicitor, a tidy, precise man in his 60s. He had handled the legal affairs of most of St. Mary Mead's residents for decades. He looked up from his desk as she entered, adjusting his spectacles. Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure. She smiled. Good afternoon, Mr. Mortimer. I was hoping you might be able to answer a small question for me. He gestured for her to sit. Of course. What is it regarding? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. The late Mrs. Eleanor Winthrop. I understand she had her will drawn up some years ago. Mr. Mortimer nodded. Yes, quite right. I handled it myself. And did she happen to make any recent amendments? The solicitor hesitated. I cannot disclose the details of a client's will until it is formally read, Miss Marple. Miss Marple's smile did not waver. Of course, but I am merely curious. You see, there has been much speculation in the village that Mrs. Winthrop may have altered her will just before her unfortunate demise. Mr. Mortimer's lips pressed into a thin line. That is an interesting question, indeed, Miss Marple said softly, because if she did, then that change might have played a role in her murder. The solicitor paled slightly. Murder, Miss Marple, surely you are not suggesting. I suggest nothing, dear Mr. Mortimer, I only seek the truth. He exhaled heavily. Mrs. Winthrop did in fact request an amendment to her will about 3 weeks before her death. However, she never returned to sign it. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. And might I ask who the new beneficiary was to be? Mr. Mortimer hesitated. Then, lowering his voice, he said, Gerald Hawkins. A change that never happened. Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing. So, at the time of her death, the previous will was still valid. Yes, Mr. Mortimer confirmed. Which means Miss Sylvia Lorimer remains the primary beneficiary. Miss Marple nodded. But if Mrs. Winthrop had lived a few days longer, that would not have been the case. Mr. Mortimer's expression darkened. Precisely. Miss Marple thanked him and left the office. Outside, she stood still for a moment, considering what she had just learned. If Eleanor had been murdered to prevent this change, then the suspect list had narrowed. One person stood to lose everything. If the new will had been signed, Sylvia Lorimer, a dangerous encounter did a mind to speak with Sylvia again. Miss Marple made her way to Lorimer Cottage. As she approached, she saw the door slightly ajar. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. She stepped inside cautiously. Miss Lorimer, no response. The sitting room was empty, but something was wrong. The papers that had been scattered during Sylvia's frantic search were now neatly stacked. The air felt unnaturally still. Miss Marple moved deeper into the house, and then she saw it. The figure of Sylvia Lorimer slumped over her desk, motionless. A teacup lay overturned beside her. Miss Marple hurried forward, pressing her fingers to Sylvia's wrist. No pulse. She straightened slowly. Sylvia Lorimer was dead. A second murder within half an hour. Inspector Craddock had arrived, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene. Poison, he muttered, examining the teacup. Looks like someone wanted to make sure she wouldn't talk. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed. Craddock turned to her. You suspected her, didn't you? Miss Marple sighed. She had motive. She was desperate to keep her inheritance, and she had been searching for something in a great panic. But it seemed someone else feared what she might find. Craddock frowned. So, if she wasn't the killer, Miss Marple's gaze was distant. Then the real murderer is still out there. Craddock rubbed his temples. 2 deaths now. Whoever we're after isn't afraid to kill again. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. No, they are not. Revisiting the clues back at her cottage, Miss Marple reviewed the facts. Eleanor Winthrop had intended to change her will. Gerald Hawkins would have inherited everything. Sylvia Lorimer had been searching for proof of this change. Had she found something dangerous? Reverend Martin had hesitated when speaking about Eleanor's past. What was he hiding? And then there was Alice Prentice. Miss Marple frowned. Alice had been behaving strangely ever since the murder. Had she known something crucial? Or was she protecting someone? Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. She needed to see Alice. Chapter 10. Alice's confession. Miss S. sharp eyes caught the movement in the darkness beyond Alice. The shadows slipped away, but not before she registered the outline of a figure, someone lurking near her cottage. She did not react outwardly, only smiling gently at Alice. Come in, my dear, she said, stepping aside. Alice hesitated, glancing over her shoulder nervously before hurrying inside. Miss Marple closed the door behind her and gestured toward the sitting room. Would you care for some tea? Alice shook her head, clasping her hands tightly in front of her. No, thank you, Miss Marple. I don't have much time. Miss Marple sat across from her, regarding the young woman with a patient expression. Take your time, dear. Tell me what's troubling you. Alice's voice trembled. It's about Mrs. Winthrop, about what happened that night. Miss Marple remained quiet, letting Alice find her words. I heard something, Alice said, her eyes darting toward the window, as if afraid someone might be listening. Something I shouldn't have. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Go on. Alice swallowed hard. I was in the kitchen when I heard voices in the study. Mrs. Winthrop was speaking to someone. She sounded frightened. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her chair. Did you recognize the other voice? Alice hesitated. No, it was too low, but there was anger in it. And then, I heard Mrs. Winthrop say, I know the truth now. I won't be silent any longer. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. And what happened after that? Alice's hands trembled. There was a crash, like something being knocked over. Then silence. I was afraid, so I didn't go in. I just waited. And a few moments later, I heard the study door open and footsteps leaving the house. Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her mind was racing. You didn't see who it was? Alice shook her head. No, but there's something else. Miss Marple waited. Alice bit her lip. Later that night, I saw Reverend Martin near the house. Miss Marple's breath caught. Reverend Martin. Alice nodded. I don't know if he was there earlier, but after everything had gone quiet, I saw him standing near the gate. He looked troubled. Miss Marple's thoughts turned rapidly. The Reverend had been reluctant to discuss Eleanor's past, and now it seemed he had been near the house that night. Was he involved, or had he simply witnessed something he was too afraid to speak about? A midnight search. Miss Marple reached out and patted Alice's hand gently. Thank you, my dear. You've been very brave to tell me this. Alice exhaled shakily. Do you think the murderer knows I heard them? Miss Marple considered. Someone had been lurking outside her cottage just moments before Alice arrived. If Alice was in danger, there was no time to waste. I think you must be very careful, Alice, Miss Marple said softly, and I think we must act quickly. Alice looked confused. Act. Miss Marple smiled slightly. I believe it is time to search Winthrop House again, and I think we must do it tonight. Returning to Winthrop House an hour later, under the cover of darkness, Miss Marple and Alice made their way toward Winthrop House. The village was quiet, the air crisp. They reached the house without incident, and Miss Marple tried the door, locked, but Alice had a key, given to her as part of her duties. With shaking fingers, she turned it in the lock. The house was silent as they stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of old books and furniture polish. Miss Marple led the way toward the study. The desk where Eleanor had once sat loomed in the dim light. Alice swallowed hard. What are we looking for? She whispered. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room. Anything that might confirm what Eleanor Winthrop discovered. She moved toward the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines. Something felt off. Miss Marple tapped lightly on the wood panel behind the shelf. A hollow sound. She murmured. Alice leaned in. What is it? Miss Marple pressed carefully, and with a soft click, a hidden compartment swung open. Inside there was a single envelope. Miss Marple retrieved it and carefully unfolded the papers within. Her breath caught. It was a letter, addressed to Gerald Hawkins. The final truth. Miss Marple read the words slowly, her eyes darkening with each line. My dear Gerald, I have spent my life in regret. I wronged you in a way I can never undo. But you must know the truth at last. You are not an orphan by misfortune. You were taken, stolen away under false pretenses. I was misled, made to believe that I was doing what was right, but I see now that I was deceived. The one responsible was Reverend Martin. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The truth was clear now. Eleanor had discovered that the Reverend had played a role in Gerald's disappearance as a child, and she had intended to tell him the truth. That was why she had been killed. Alice whispered. Reverend Martin. But why? Miss Marple sighed. Because he wasn't acting as a man of God that day. He was acting as a man protecting his own family's secret. Gerald was not just any child. He was the son of someone important to him, someone whose scandal had to be hidden. Alice's eyes widened. You mean? Miss Marple nodded. I believe Gerald's real mother was the Reverend's own sister, a young girl who had fallen pregnant out of wedlock. Rather than face disgrace, she was sent away, and the baby Gerald was given up under false pretenses. But Eleanor found out, and Reverend Martin could not allow the truth to be revealed. A floorboard creaked behind them. Miss Marple turned sharply. There, standing in the doorway, was Reverend Martin. His face was unreadable, but his hands trembled. You shouldn't have come here, Miss Marple. Alice let out a quiet gasp. Miss Marple remained calm. You killed Eleanor, didn't you? The Reverend's eyes darkened. She was going to ruin everything. Gerald didn't need to know. No one did. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. And Sylvia, did she know the truth as well? His jaw tightened. She was getting too close. She had to be stopped. Miss Marple sighed. So you poisoned her. His shoulders sagged. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Alice gripped Miss Marple's arm. What do we do? Miss Marple's expression didn't waver. We leave that to the police, my dear. Chapter 11. The Last Confession. Tense silence in Winthrop House was broken only by the steady sound of approaching footsteps. Reverend Martin's gaze darted toward the doorway, his shoulders stiffening as the unmistakable voice of Inspector Craddock called out once more, Miss Marple. Miss Marple remained composed, her eyes never leaving the Reverend's face. We're in the study, Inspector, she called, her voice steady. The clatter of boots against the wooden floor grew louder, and within moments, Inspector Craddock appeared in the doorway, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Good Lord, he muttered, stepping forward. What's all this about? His gaze flickered from Miss Marple to Alice, then settled on Reverend Martin, whose hands trembled slightly at his sides. Thought Miss Marple inclined her head toward the open secret compartment in the bookcase. I believe we have found the final piece of the puzzle. Inspector Craddock's eyes scanned the letter Miss Marple had placed on the desk. He picked it up, his jaw tightening as he read. So this is what Eleanor Winthrop discovered, he murmured. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she learned the truth about Gerald Hawkins, that he was not, as he had believed, an abandoned orphan but a child taken from his mother under false pretenses, and the person responsible for ensuring that secret remained buried was Reverend Martin. Craddock's expression darkened as he looked up, and she was silenced because of it. The Reverend's breathing had grown shallow, his face pale. In the dim light of the study, he remained silent, but the guilt was already etched into his features. Miss Marple pressed gently. You were afraid, weren't you, Reverend? Afraid of what would happen if the truth about Gerald became known, afraid that your family's name would be ruined, that your sister's past indiscretion would be dragged into the light after all these years. Reverend Martin finally spoke, his voice hoarse. You don't understand, he whispered. Then help us understand, Miss Marple urged softly, his hands clenched into fists. My sister was just a girl, 17 years old. She was naive, trusting, and she made a terrible mistake. The man who fathered Gerald wanted nothing to do with her. My parents, they were furious. In those days, a scandal like that, it would have destroyed our family. He swallowed hard. They sent her away, made arrangements for the child to be placed with a respectable family, but at the last moment, the adoption fell through. Eleanor Winthrop took him instead. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And she never knew the full truth, did she? Not until recently. He shook his head. No. At the time, she believed she was helping. It wasn't until a few weeks ago that she uncovered the details, how my parents manipulated everything, how Gerald's birth records had been altered to make him appear as though he had no living relatives. Miss Marple's expression remained sympathetic, but her next words were firm. So when she confronted you, you saw no way out but to silence her. The Reverend's lips trembled. I didn't mean to. He exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to his forehead. She was determined. Said she would tell Gerald the truth. She wanted to put things right, but she didn't understand what that would mean for me, for my sister, who has spent her whole life trying to forget. Miss Marple's voice was calm but unyielding. You pushed her, didn't you? His shoulders sagged. She wouldn't stop. I lost my temper. She stumbled, hit her head. His voice cracked. I didn't mean for it to happen. But then I saw the letter she had written, the one addressed to Gerald. I knew I couldn't let it reach him. Inspector Craddock's expression was hard. And so you took it, hid it away, hoping no one would ever find out. Reverend Martin let out a bitter laugh. But Sylvia suspected something, didn't she? She knew Eleanor had discovered something important. That's why she was searching the house so frantically. He swallowed. I thought I could frighten her into staying silent. But she was relentless. She wouldn't stop digging. Miss Marple's eyes held his. And so you poisoned her. His breath hitched. She was getting too close. She might have found the letter. I had no choice. Craddock's patience had worn thin. You had plenty of choices, Reverend. You chose murder. Reverend Martin closed his eyes briefly. I did. A heavy silence filled the room. Craddock gestured toward the constable standing by the door. Take him in. The constable stepped forward, placing a firm hand on the Reverend's arm. Miss Marple observed the scene quietly, her sharp mind still sifting through every detail. Justice had been served, but there was one last matter to attend to, telling Gerald the truth next morning. Miss Marple sat in the small tea room of St. Mary Mead, stirring her tea thoughtfully as Gerald Hawkins arrived. His face was weary, lined with confusion and sadness. "You said you wanted to see me, Miss Marple," he asked as he took a seat opposite her. She regarded him with quiet kindness. "Yes, dear boy. I thought it best you hear the truth from a friend rather than through whispers in the village." He frowned. "The truth?" Miss Marple set down her teacup. "About your past. About who you really are." Gerald blinked. "I don't understand." Miss Marple took a breath. "Eleanor Winthrop wasn't just your guardian. She was the only person who knew the truth about your origins. You see, Gerald, you were not abandoned. You were taken." He stared at her. "Taken," she nodded. "Your mother was a young woman from a well-respected family. She had you out of wedlock, and her family, desperate to protect their name, arranged for you to be given away under false pretenses." She met his eyes. "Your real mother is still alive." Gerald inhaled sharply, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Who is she?" Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before saying softly, "The sister of Reverend Martin." The silence stretched between them. When Gerald finally spoke, his voice was raw. "She knew. All these years." Miss Marple nodded. "She believed it was for the best. And perhaps, in those days, she truly thought she had no other choice. But Eleanor Winthrop, she wanted to right that wrong, and that is why she died." Gerald lowered his head, his expression unreadable. "So all this, the murder, the secrets, it was all because of me." Miss Marple reached across the table, patting his hand gently. "No, dear boy, it was because of fear. Fear of the past, fear of scandal, fear of the truth." She smiled, faintly, "But fear is not the same as guilt. You have done nothing wrong." Gerald let out a shaky breath. "And my mother? What happens now?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "That choice is yours, Gerald. But I think you'll find that the past is never as unchangeable as people believe. Sometimes, it just needs a chance to be rewritten." He looked away, deep in thought. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Her work finally done. Chapter 12. A new beginning. Village of St. Mary Mead had settled into its usual rhythm. Its thatched cottages and quiet lanes giving no sign of the turmoil that had unfolded in recent days. The scandal of Eleanor Winthrop's murder, the arrest of Reverend Martin, and the shocking truth about Gerald Hawkins' past had sent ripples through the community. Yet life carried on. The news would be discussed in hushed tones at the grocer's, debated over afternoon tea, and dissected by those who fancied themselves amateur detectives. But for Miss Marple, her work was done, or nearly done. She sat in her usual chair by the window, knitting needles clicking softly as she reflected on the events of the past week. There was one final matter to settle. A conversation that needed to happen before she could truly consider this case closed. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She set down her knitting and moved briskly to open it, already knowing who she would find standing there. Gerald Hawkins. His face was drawn, his usual confident air replaced by something more uncertain. He held his hat in his hands, turning it absently. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She smiled kindly and stepped aside. "Come in, dear boy." Gerald hesitated, then stepped inside. The warmth of the cottage, the scent of fresh tea, seemed to steady him. "I wasn't sure where else to go," he admitted, settling into the chair she indicated. Miss Marple poured the tea with practiced ease. "It's quite understandable," she said gently. "You have a great deal to think about." He let out a breath, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know what to do. All my life, I thought I was an orphan. And now I learned that my real mother is still alive, has been alive all this time." His voice was strained. "And she never came for me." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "She was young, Gerald, very young, and frightened. In those days, a scandal of that nature could ruin a girl's future completely. She was made to believe that giving you up was the only way to protect you." Gerald looked away. "Reverend Martin said she tried to forget, that she never wanted me back." Miss Marple's sharp eyes softened. That's what he believed. Or, perhaps, what he wanted to believe. But people are not so easily rid of the past, my dear. Especially when the past holds something as precious as a child. He swallowed hard. "So you think she regrets it?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I think there's only one way to find out." A meeting long overdue. Gerald had resisted at first, but by the following afternoon, he had agreed. Miss Marple arranged everything. The meeting was to take place at a quiet inn in the next village, away from the curious eyes of St. Mary Mead. As they arrived, Gerald was visibly tense, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" he asked under his breath. Not Miss Marple patted his arm reassuringly. "I believe she does." Inside, a woman sat alone at a corner table, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She was in her early 50s now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her eyes full of quiet apprehension. Miss Marple led Gerald forward. "My dear, this is Mrs. Margaret Lorimer, and of course, Gerald Hawkins." Margaret's breath caught as she looked at him. "Gerald," she whispered. He stared at her, struggling to find his voice. "So it's true, you're my mother." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. "I am." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Margaret spoke. "I never wanted to give you up." Her voice trembled. "But I was young, and I had no say in the matter. My parents, they were strict, and my brother," she shook her head, "they told me it was the only way. They said you'd be better off, that I'd ruin your life if I kept you." Gerald swallowed hard. "And did you ever try to find me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Every day. But by the time I had the courage to search, you were gone. No records. No way to trace you. I thought I had lost you forever." His jaw clenched. "And yet you never told me. Even when you knew where I was." Margaret's hands trembled. "I was afraid. Afraid that you would hate me. That it was too late." She hesitated, then whispered, "And I was ashamed." A tense silence followed. Gerald struggled to process everything. Miss Marple watched them both, then spoke gently. "It is never too late for the truth, nor for forgiveness." Gerald exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to feel." Margaret reached for his hand. "Then, let's take time. No expectations, no pressure, just time." He hesitated, then slowly, he covered her hand with his dot. Miss Marple smiled softly. The past had been mended, at least enough for a new beginning. One last visit a week later, Miss Marple found herself standing before Eleanor Winthrop's grave. The case was over. Reverend Martin had confessed, the truth had been uncovered, and Gerald had begun the difficult process of reconnecting with his mother. But justice, Miss Marple knew, was only part of the story. Eleanor had spent her final days trying to right a wrong. She had sought truth, not for her own benefit, but for another's, and for that, she had paid the ultimate price. Miss Marple laid a single white rose on the grave. "Rest well, dear lady," she murmured. "Your work is done." A new mystery beckoned us. Miss Marple turned to leave. A familiar figure approached. "Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple," he greeted. She smiled. "Inspector, what brings you here?" He hesitated, then handed her a folded letter. "I received this in the post this morning," he said. "It's addressed to you." Miss Marple frowned slightly, taking the letter and unfolding it. As she read, her expression shifted. First curiosity, then something deeper. She looked up at the inspector, eyes sharp with interest. "Well now," she murmured, "this is rather intriguing." Craddock gave her a wry look. "Another mystery." Miss Marple tucked the letter away with a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps," she said lightly, "or perhaps just a new puzzle to solve." And with that, she walked away, already piecing together the clues of what was to come. The end, or perhaps a beginning. Thank you for tuning in to Mystery Unlocked. If you enjoyed the intrigue, suspense, and the thrill of the chase, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay updated on more captivating detective adventures that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Your support makes it possible to continue bringing these stories to life. Keep the mysteries alive until next time.